Good morning. It's Jessica once again, and today I wanted to take some time to mull over Persuasion by Jane Austen. Look, I found this cover, of course it's not going to focus, this gloriously 1970s edition. Look, this is not what a British naval officer's hat would have looked like. Ugh, anyway, I just love it so much. Not the point. I was recently rereading this book on an absolute whim, and as I was going along, I was noticing so many things for the first time and repeatedly thinking to myself, was I even paying attention when I originally read this? Survey says no, so I don't know what was going on with my initial reading, but luckily for all of you, I seem to be doing a much better job on a reread, and I was particularly struck by the opening of the book, which is to say the first 3 chapters. I have absolutely been stewing on them and rereading them for quite a few weeks. And I've even, persuaded, not really, a better term would be strong-armed, my partner into letting me read the book out loud to him, like usually like at night before we go to bed, because I felt like it would help me process what I wanted to talk about, and oh, God bless him, because it really has helped. And incidentally, I realized through doing that I don't think I've ever read Jane Austen out loud before, like an entire novel start to finish, and it was a really interesting experience. I think Austen lends herself well to that, which is a whole other discussion you could have about why that is. Anyway, focus. We're focusing. So, what I want to discuss for this video is, as I said, the opening 3 chapters of Persuasion and what I think they're doing, both thematically and narratively. So we shall see if I have bitten off more than I can chew with that. So for a bit of necessary background, Persuasion is Jane Austen's final novel that she completed before she died. The woman's been dead for over 200 years and I still can't get over it. And also I believe her shortest novel. It was published posthumously, I think I'm saying, yes, posthumously, in 1817. Very broad brush. It details the emotional journey of a woman named Anne Elliot as she is thrown back into acquaintance, coincidentally, with a man she had been engaged to 8 years previously, but broke it off. So how do we begin this book? Or put another way maybe, what does Austen do in these first 3 chapters? And why does she do it that way? And of course we can't ask her. This is purely me speculating as an avid fan. So firstly, she immediately, I mean like instantaneously, sets up several important themes that are going to run throughout the book. One of these themes is not a discussion. Austen isn't stylistically going to discuss her themes like Eliot or Dickens or something, but maybe just like a continual suggestion, subtle proposition throughout the book of social class in Great Britain and how it is changing, shifting, reallocating. Yes, reallocating at the point in time that this book, this novel is set in, which is 1814 when it begins. So how does she introduce this theme of social class? We are immediately, I mean like immediately given what is, I checked, the longest opening sentence in all of Austen's novels. And that's interesting to me because, you know, I think she's very well known for her infamous opening line of Pride and Prejudice, you know, does a truth universally acknowledge, blah, blah, blah. But even that one as well, all the others are a fair bit shorter than this one. So here it is, we're gonna read the whole thing. And as I said, it is a bit long, so, you know, buckle up. Sir Walter Elliot of Kellynch Hall in Somersetshire was a man who, for his own amusement, never took up any book but the baronetage. There he found occupation for an idle hour and consolation in a distressed one. There his faculties were roused into admiration and respect by contemplating the limited remnant of the earliest patents. There any unwelcome sensations arising from domestic affairs changed naturally into pity and contempt. As he turned over the almost endless creations of the last century, and there, if every other leaf were powerless, he could read his own history with an interest which never failed. Okay, so I think it's very easy to read this first sentence and just think, okay, we're being introduced to a character. Meet Sir Walter. And of course we are being introduced to a character, but through that introduction, we're being told so much more about how this story is going to go. The fact that the first word is Sir, a title. Sir Walter Elliot of Kellynch Hall. You are immediately being presented with the peerage. Well, kind of. Sir Walter is a baronet, which is like a weird nebulous spot between the peerage and the landed gentry. It's a whole thing. Anyway, we're immediately given this idea of rank. You know, the theme of social class, as I mentioned before. And to really drive it home, not only is this Sir Walter, but what's his favorite thing to do that we're told he indulges in frequently? He reads the baronetage, which, you know, I won't get into a big breakdown of it. You totally could, it's fascinating, but basically it's a record book of all the noble families in Great Britain and how they came to be. So, you know, I feel this is a very clear indication right off the bat. We are going to be looking at social class thematically. That is something to keep in mind. And as we continue through the first chapter, the other two characters that we're introduced to at length are Sir Walter's eldest child, Elizabeth Elliot. He has three daughters, the other two are Anne and Mary, and the Elliots' longtime neighbor and family friend, the widowed Lady Russell. This is also significant. We are told extensively about Sir Walter's eldest daughter, Elizabeth, his eldest child, who, due to her mother having died many years ago and her father never remarrying, is the female head of house at Kellynch Hall. And Lady Russell, their neighbor, was married to a knight and has also never remarried and often helps out, I suppose, with different things in the Elliot family because she was great friends with the deceased Lady Elliot and feels very emotionally attached to the family due to that. So, three minute descriptions of three people who have very specific claims to rank and importance. And I don't think that's accidental. And we are also told that these people really care about rank all three of them. They each have a different way that manifests, but they're all invested in the idea that a titled individual has certain assumed privileges and significance compared to other people. And they are all three contrasted in the first chapter with Sir Walter's heir, which, you know, his heir can't be any of his daughters because, remember, women can't usually inherit titles or land. Sometimes, but usually not. But in this case it has to be a man. So it's Mr. William Walter Elliot, who's like a distant second cousin or something, who seems to be wholly unconcerned with the title and property that he's going to come into. And all three of them, Sir Walter, Elizabeth Elliot, and Lady Russell, are very offended by this, again, kind of each in their own way. So by the end of the first chapter, it has been made very clear that class, rank, social structure is going to be a big part of this book. Not least because we learn at the close of chapter 1 that Sir Walter is having money problems. Yeah, he is deeply in debt because he regularly spends beyond his means due to vanity, basically. He's a very vain man. That's how his investment in rank has been internalized, just sort of, being egotistical and very vain. So as we go into chapter 2, much of the narrative energy is dedicated to describing how these money problems came to be and what Lady Russell and Elizabeth are doing, to attempt to plan to combat this, annoying issue. So I think that leads nicely into the second theme I want to talk about that gets set up here in the opening chapters. So first it was, class, social standing, and now, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the book's title, is the theme of persuasion. So, this idea thematically is also very clear to me, even in that opening sentence. What is Sir Walter doing? He's reading his favorite book and trying to persuade himself of his own importance. That whole big, huge sentence with all of those semicolons is mostly dedicated to describing his own attempts at persuasion for himself about himself, which is great. It's so great because we learn soon after that this is very consistent with his vain, egotistical personality. So I'm going to read through the first sentence again. And as I read, I'll probably interject a little bit just to sort of point out the persuasive language. All right, so this is the first sentence again. Sir Walter Elliot of Kellynch Hall in Somersetshire was a man who, for his own amusement, never took up any book but the Baronetage. There he found occupation for an idle hour and consolation in a distressed one. Ooh, so the book consoles him, right? To console someone is a very persuasive behavior, I think, or at least it can be. And also that he has distressed hours, right? I love how Austen just sort of drops that in and leaves it there, for the sort of savvy, discerning reader, like, well, why is he distressed? She doesn't really tell you right now. But, the fact that this book is consolation in a distressed hour, we're starting with the persuasive language. There, his faculties were roused into admiration and respect. So he has to be roused, another sort of persuasive word, into admiration and distress to get him out of, or admiration and respect to get him out of the distress that he's been feeling, by contemplating the limited remnant of the earliest patents. There, reading the book, any unwelcome sensations arising from domestic affairs. Well, we learn later he's massively in debt, right? So, unwelcome sensations. Unwelcome sensations arising from domestic affairs changed naturally into pity and contempt. And that naturally there, I just think is absolutely fantastic. I feel like that is such a, I don't know if this is really a word, but Austenian ironic. She loves irony of the use of the word naturally, because of course it's not natural. We already know he's sitting here reading the book trying to get himself out of the bad mood, to sort of get himself to feel more admirable and respectable and important by reading the book. So of course it's not natural at all. So I just love that. So any unwelcome sensations arising from domestic affairs changed naturally into pity and contempt. Ooh, wow. Okay, so like we're shooting for pity and contempt. Oh my goodness. As he turned over the almost endless creations of the last century, and there, if every other leaf were powerless, he could read his own history with an interest which never failed. So even if nothing else works, even if none of the other sections will persuade him to feel better again, reading about himself will do it. So again, we're being introduced along with class to this idea of persuasion. And particularly with this first passage, I feel like it's hinting at an idea that I think continues to be like an undercurrent through this book, which is the difference between persuasion and delusion. And I use the word delusion not in the crazy hallucination sense of the word that I think we tend to use it that way now, usually when talking about if someone's having a delusion. But no, I use it like in the definition of being deluded in something, belief in something that isn't really true or reality-based. And I think the tension between persuasion and delusion is throughout this book. And we get that immediately in this description of Sir Walter, who, as we come to learn, has an endless capacity for self-delusion. Or, as the kids would say, embracing a delulu is the salulu mindset, because I'm very hip and cool and up with all the phrases. So yeah, if you want to think of it that way. So, as I said, this leads nicely into the transition from chapter 1 to chapter 2, because Lady Russell and Elizabeth Elliot begin planning how to get out of the financial hole with all this debt that Sir Walter has racked up. And much of the opening of chapter 2 is dedicated to describing how Sir Walter and Elizabeth, as it turns out, can be persuaded to deal rationally with this debt. Up until now, it's been mostly ignored in a delusional kind of way. And it's here that we get introduced to Mr. Shepherd, the lawyer, who is a wonderful comedic relief, in my opinion. And it becomes obvious is deeply aware of how Sir Walter needs to be handled in order to become more persuadable. So Lady Russell even says, after an initial plan has been drawn up, that I think the actual direct quote is, "If we can persuade your father to all this, much may be done." So as it turns out, plan number 1 is absolute anathema to Sir Walter, and they have to, go back to the drawing board. But after several fits and starts, Sir Walter is finally persuaded to quit Kellynch Hall and basically rent it out for a period in order to economize and generate some money in order to pay off all of these debts that he's incurred. And this conclusion finally being made is what leads us into chapter 3. And these two themes, class and persuasion, continue to be front and center as this chapter begins, because unlike the two that precede it, it begins with dialogue. We open with dialogue for the first time, and I think this is kind of something to take note of. This Persuasion is not what I would call a dialogue-driven book. Very unlike, I would say Pride and Prejudice is very much a dialogue-driven book. So if you go into Persuasion hoping that you're going to get the Pride and Prejudice vibe, you're not. Okay, that's not what's going to be happening. Still slaps, still fabulous, but it's a different choice. It's a different choice that we've made. So we open with dialogue for the first time, and what is it? It's Mr. Shepherd, the lawyer, persuasively, he hopes, laying out the argument that a naval officer would perhaps be an ideal tenant for Kellynch Hall. Brilliant. Just, Jane is just weaving it all together. So, because of course Sir Walter is horrified, just initially horrified at the idea of a Navy man being in charge of Kellynch Hall. This goes against every single one of his most dearly held snobberies. A military person as the head of a landed estate, even as a renter, is just unacceptable to him in terms of accepted social hierarchy. They don't deserve such a place. And the irony here is rich, because of course Sir Walter doesn't actually deserve what he has anymore, because he's squandered it, so he doesn't deserve it either. But that's a side quest. So you have this entire discussion of class as we're moving through chapter 3, with our first really healthy doses of dialogue, as all of Sir Walter's friends and family are trying with all their best intellectual power to persuade him that this would be fine. Actually, this is really a good idea. And it takes a lot of convincing, because he absolutely does not feel that naval officers are of equal standing with a baronet like himself. And also, side note, footnote, the very fact that society has moved in Great Britain in such a way that naval officers can and do rent landed properties, is a whole subtle hint in and of itself of the changing social landscape. So there's that. And it's here, 25 pages, genuinely I counted 25 pages into the book, that we are given the first actual spoken words of Anne Elliot. No less electric for their introduction. Here Anne spoke. You can almost feel the finally in there. Finally, Anne gets to speak, and she says, "The Navy, I think, who have done so much for us, have at least an equal claim with any other set of men. For all the comforts and all the privileges which any home can give, sailors work hard enough for their comforts. We must all allow." So the very first thing the reader gets to actually hear her say, that she's actually speaking, is a defense, a bolstering of the importance of the Navy, and that they deserve respect, an equal claim with any other set of men. Whew! What a bomb of an opening line. Now knowing all that we know of these people, right? Like, we've been told now for dozens of pages what, hierarchically minded snobs Sir Walter and his daughter and Lady Elliot are. And then you have Anne saying that men of the Navy, they work hard and they have an equal claim with any other set of men. Whew. So just, an absolutely casual grenade toss into the conversation that is still, of course, in keeping with this, or these, not this, these thematic elements of persuasion and class. And I'm assuming it's probably quite obvious by now, from how I've built this up, that we've been missing Anne. Remember how I said this whole story is about a woman named Anne Elliot? Where has Anne been in all of this narrative energy? Talking about her father, her older sister, her mother's best friend. Where has she been? So this is the second thing I want to talk about with these opening chapters. The first was how those two big thematic elements are set up, and the second is how we're introduced to our main character, Anne Elliot. And this was the thing most striking to me when I reread the book, and actually really prompted the whole video. This makes me sound much more glamorous than I actually am. This will not happen again for a very long time probably, but I was starting my reread of this book while I was sitting eating dinner alone at a hotel bar. And just all of a sudden, as I'm going along, I was like, where is Anne? Like, where the hell is she? This had not occurred to me structurally at all the first time I read this book. So now we're gonna go back and look at how Austen introduces us narratively, up through her first, or I guess a bit past her first line of dialogue in chapter 3 to our main character Anne, because I think it's brilliant and just endlessly interesting. So to be clear, it's not that Anne isn't mentioned at all in these first 3 chapters. She is, but for the woman we come to realize is like the gravity force around which everything else in the novel revolves, it's an unusual type of narrative structuring that Austen has chosen. So, as we already know, the book opens with Sir Walter reading his favorite book. And our first mention of Anne is via the entry in that book about the Elliot family history. And it is literally just Anne, born August 9th, 1787, as you read the transcription of that section of the book. Talk about detached, right? So we've already had, just with that opening paragraph that I read before of Sir Walter, a much more intimate and kind of colorful portrait of him. And it's only been one paragraph of the book. So for the first few pages, it's almost as though Sir Walter is the main character. He is narratively getting main character energy from the author. And I feel like this is such a brilliant and funny narrative trick by Austen. I can just picture her giggling as she wrote it, because it both maybe tricks the reader into thinking that Sir Walter is the main focus of the book, and mirrors the way that Sir Walter thinks of himself. He absolutely thinks he is the main character of everything, of anything. But the irony is, which, unsurprising, nobody loves irony the way Jane Austen does. But the irony is, of course, we know as the reader, the further along that we go, that this egotistical vanity is also deeply diluted. So it's almost like the reader starts, getting introduced to this family through the delusional self-aggrandizement of Sir Walter and how he views himself in the world as the main character. But then it's like we get the rug pulled out from under us, right? It's like, just kidding, he thinks he's the main character, plot twist, he's not. So I just love that. I love that so much. And you can contrast this opening of the novel with the introduction that we get of like, an Emma Woodhouse in the novel. Emma, it's so different, and you could just have a field day doing that, but we're focusing. Okay, so what's the second thing that we learn about Anne Elliot after her date of birth? Well, first of all, pages later, that in and of itself, right? She gets mentioned through the transcription of the book and then nothing for pages. We learned that Anne is least loved by her father. And incidentally, I just have to say, the descriptions, the little like asides and throwaway additions we get about Anne are just so death by a thousand cuts. I just can't stand it. The tone is so matter of fact, but the information that you're being given is so heartbreaking. I mean, just again, narratively ingenious. I think you're going to see what I mean when I read this section. So here's this first bit we get about Anne that's not, transcribed from the Baronetage book. His two other children, so it's been talking about how Sir Walter really, really loves his eldest child, Elizabeth, but his two other children were of very inferior value. Mary had acquired a little artificial importance by becoming Mrs. Charles Musgrove, but Anne, with an elegance of mind and sweetness of character, which must have placed her high with any people of real understanding, was nobody with either father or sister. Her word had no weight. Her convenience was always to give way. She was only Anne. So, with this first description of who she is as a person, we're told she is quite smart and with good character, but completely unappreciated and ignored by her own father, her own sister, and we are also still only being told about her through the lens of what her family thinks of her, right? And just, that phrasing, she was nobody. She was nobody to either father or sister. Only Anne. Only nobody. And then, even after that, we do move into two kind of, sizable paragraphs that really focus on Anne, but much of it is via Lady Russell. So we're being told how Lady Russell feels about Anne. And it's much more positive and nice than what we get from her father and sister. But even so, we are still so removed from her as the reader. It's almost like if you were at a party and there were a bunch of people there who all had a mutual friend that they started discussing, who was not in attendance, who was not there. And each person tells you what they think their friend is like, but you haven't actually met them. So you're building a picture, but it's not from personal acquaintance with that person themselves because they're not there. It's just through what other people are telling you. That's what this feels like to me. So, okay, we got the, the soul crushing, she was nobody. And then we get, to Lady Russell, indeed, she was a most dear and highly valued goddaughter, favorite and friend. Lady Russell loved them all, but it was only in Anne that she could fancy the mother to revive again. A few years before, Anne Elliot had been a very pretty girl, but her bloom had vanished early. Interesting, why has her bloom vanished? And as even in its height, her father had found little to admire in her, another little cut there, so totally different were her delicate features and mild dark eyes from his own, there could be nothing in them, now that she was faded and thin, to excite his esteem. He had never indulged much hope, he had now none, of ever reading her name in any other page of his favorite work. All equality of alliance must rest with Elizabeth. So after that, we're straight back to discussing Elizabeth for literal pages, right? Anne got a couple paragraphs, and now we're back on Lizzie for pages and pages. It's like these just passing but crushing descriptions of Anne, and then we just move on. We just move on to the people we were learning about before. Like I really feel like you just have to keep reminding yourself, like, oh, like there she is. Like, look, the main character. Like, like you kind of forget she's continually pushed to the side narratively in the beginning. You know, just again, like the narrative structure is kind of mirroring her family's treatment of her, as it mirrors Sir Walter's, you know, deluded vision of himself. That's just so structurally fascinating, isn't it? I love that. It's so good. So we continue all the way through the rest of chapter 1, learning about Elizabeth and her woes and her attitude toward the heir, Mr. Elliot, and, you know, then it's all about the money problems and the debt and Lady Russell and Mr. Shepherd and trying to figure out a plan, and that is it. End chapter 1. Like, not much of Anne at all. So then we move into chapter 2, and all of a sudden there's another mention of Anne. After quite a hiatus of any reference to her at all, Lady Russell decides to consult her about this debt situation. So let's see. So this is Lady Russell, she drew up plans of economy, she made exact calculations, and she did what nobody else thought of doing. She consulted Anne, who never seemed considered by the others as having any interest in the question. Oh. So, you know, nobody ever asks Anne what she thinks about anything, but let's continue on. So Lady Russell, she consulted and in a degree was influenced by her. So Lady Russell is being persuaded a little bit by Anne. Ooh, that's interesting. In marking out the scheme of retrenchment, which was at last submitted to Sir Walter. Every emendation of Anne's had been on the side of honesty against importance. She wanted more vigorous measures, a more complete reformation, a quicker release from debt, a much higher tone of indifference for everything but justice and equity. Okay, so here we're finally getting a little bit more description from the narrative voice, if you will. And it's interesting, isn't it? Anne has a depth of character. Her values system is obviously different from the rest of her family, right? And it's in the following paragraph that we get what I feel is the first really clear look into Anne's thinking directly, that we are actually hearing from Anne herself. It's basically an explanation of why she has drafted such a financial plan. And it says, this was the principle, and the principle is Anne has been talking to Lady Russell, and Lady Russell makes a comment that there is still more due to the character of an honest man. Like, that's why it's important to get rid of this debt. And so then, this, character of an honest man was the principle on which Anne wanted her father to be proceeding, his friends to be urging him. She considered it as an act of indispensable duty. Those are strong words. Indispensable duty. To clear away the claims of creditors with all the expedition which the most comprehensive retrenchments could secure, and saw no dignity in anything short of it. She wanted it to be prescribed and felt it as a duty. Oh, we've had duty twice now. She rated Lady Russell's influence highly, and as to the severe degree of self-denial which her own conscience prompted, she believed there might be little more difficulty in persuading them, her father and sister, to a complete than to half a reformation. All right. Whew. Like I just feel like every sentence of Austen, you could just really sit there and dive into it, and you just find so much in every sentence. So anyway, finally, a look into her mind. We don't hear her speak, but we're kind of hearing her thinking, perhaps. by the narrative voice, and damn, she's kind of a force, isn't she? Which is fascinating because that is not the impression we've gotten thus far, right? She's principled, she's resolute, she is smart, she works well under pressure, she's commendable, she's an admirable person. We finally get this glimpse of main character energy, if you will. And then what happens? Let's read and see what happens. So Sir Walter is presented with this plan that Lady Russell and Anne have created. But then it says, how Anne's more rigid requisitions might have been taken is of little consequence. Lady Russell's had no success at all, could not be put up with, were not to be borne. So the implication here is Elizabeth and Sir Walter Elliot couldn't even handle the sort of gentler suggestions to economize from Lady Russell, so we don't even need to ask what they would have thought of Anne's. Anne's didn't even get presented, like, well, we're just chucking that one in the bin because, like, they're not going to go for that. So the story just moves along. Next, right? Like, every time it's like we get this little bit of her and then just off. Anyway, moving on, something else. So the idea of leaving Kellynch is finally landed on, renting it out for however long. And we get a couple more of those little death by a thousand cuts comments about Anne. And the one that strikes most to my heart is on page 19, I think. They're trying to decide where to go live. If they're going to leave Kellynch and they need to go live somewhere else, where do they want to go? And it says there had been 3 alternatives: London, Bath, or another house in the country. All Anne's wishes had been for the latter, a small house in their own neighborhood where they might still have Lady Russell's society, still be near Mary, and still have the pleasure of sometimes seeing the lawns and groves of Kellynch was the object of her ambition. This is her home. She's lived here her whole life. She wants to at least be nearby, like the comfort of being able to see it, But the usual fate of Anne attended her, in having something very opposite from her inclination fixed on. She disliked Bath and did not think it agreed with her, and Bath was to be her home. Ugh. Dang, right? So, there's such quiet tragedy in it, isn't there? So the story moves along. We gallop through the rest of chapter 2 and then open chapter 3, as I mentioned before, with our first dialogue to begin a chapter. Not of Anne, of course, like, let's not be crazy, right? But Mr. Shepherd trying to persuade he'd be so offended, Sir Walter, about having a naval officer as a tenant. And after several pages, we have Anne's first piece of dialogue that I read a little bit ago. And then what happens? I bet you could guess, at least, generally. Her father says, "The profession has its utility, but I should be sorry to see any friend of mine belonging to it." Once again, dismissal, immediate rebuttal, and she doesn't say anything, at least not that we're told, while Sir Walter goes off on this gigantic diatribe, which is, of course, incredibly insulting and prejudiced, and this carries on for pages because, of course it does, it's Sir Walter. And then we land on Mr. Shepherd suggesting that an Admiral Croft, in particular, would make an excellent tenant. He has met him during quarter sessions, and this would just be very ideal. And as it happens, Admiral Croft's wife is sister to none other than one Mr. Frederick Wentworth, now known as Captain Wentworth, and there are 2 Wentworth brothers that lived very briefly in the area many years before. So Shepherd's trying to build a, see, this is someone with a connection to people you've met before. type of argument. Spoiler, this completely crashes and burns because Sir Walter is, unimpressed with this social resume. Shock. So, the only other interjections we get from Anne in this chapter while she's in company are to help along Mr. Shepherd, who is having trouble making the connections with the Crofts, and it's very fun. I mean, he's just very funny. And twice Anne has to kind of like help him along, first by reminding him about Admiral Croft's military resume, and then by telling him the name, Mr. Wentworth, of Mrs. Croft's brother when he can't recall it. And this is just more beautiful and subtle foreshadowing, because why does Anne remember all of these details about these people when nobody else does, right? Anyway, and so chapter 3 concludes with Sir Walter finally conceding to allow Admiral Croft to let Kellynch Hall while they go live in Bath. Of course, with many more bigoted remarks and, bashing of people who are curates. And then we conclude the chapter with this. So this is the very last paragraph of chapter 3. Mr. Shepherd was completely empowered to act, and no sooner had such an end been reached than Anne, who had been a most attentive listener to the whole, left the room to seek the comfort of cool air for her flushed cheeks, and as she walked along a favorite grove, said with a gentle sigh, "A few months more, and he, perhaps, may be walking here." Dun dun dun! What a cliffhanger. Oh my gosh, this just so delights me, all of it. I just love it. Gorgeous. So, with this final paragraph of chapter 3, we reach what I think is the turning point. For the first time, we see Anne, we go with Anne to solitude. She's alone. And we get to see her and hear her when she's unobserved by anybody else besides the reader. And it's here that she reveals something to the reader. There's a hymn. And not only is there a hymn, but it's a hymn whose presence would be significant enough to inspire pretty big reactions from her. It kind of already has the attentive listening and the flushed cheeks and everything. But we're left with this tantalizing little moment that has been built up to with just such great subtlety. And it alerts us that Anne Elliot is perhaps made of more than she has ever given credit for, right? There's more to her than meets the eye. And of course, we already know this to a point, with each small bit of introduction we get of her. There's another tiny degree to which we're made aware of her as a full person. But, she has an emotional depth that I think we haven't seen until now. So I present all of this. And partly why I found it so interesting was because right after I had had this epiphany about the opening structure, I kind of stumbled across several analysis videos on YouTube. I mean, I'm sure the algorithm was like, oh, let's offer her up some Persuasion shit because she's been talking about it endlessly. So the only ones that even mentioned anything about the narrative structure that I saw, of course, were firstly one by a creator called Tudor Smith, and not tutor like a teacher, tutor like the Tudors, Tudor, who he does great literary analysis, and he actually had just finished up like a whole series on Persuasion that was really excellent. You should totally watch them. They're really good. And then the other was a lecture given by the British professor Belinda Jack at Gresham College, and it's quite an older video, like it's not super recent or anything, but Oh, it had some very long and highfalutin title that I'm not going to remember, but the main thrust of her argument was around sort of the rhetorical elements of persuasion. Also very interesting, very good. But both of these people said something similar. And in both cases, it was a bit of like a passing comment on the way to something else. And they both mentioned how the narration of the novel is through Anne's consciousness. So, in other words, the way that the reader receives all their information is through how Anne sees things. This was so interesting to me because I immediately thought, I don't agree exactly. To be clear, I think this becomes true at a certain point in the book. You become aware as the reader that most everything is filtered through Anne's understanding and judgment and reasoning. But I think in the beginning, that is not the case. Look, I'm not a professional, so, take it with a grain of salt. I could be 100% wrong, but I think Austen's doing something else in these first 3 chapters. So she is, of course, using that method that she invented, perfected, of free indirect discourse, in which the narrative voice sort of floats in and out of different people without much warning. And I mean, there are lots of great explanation videos of this that you can find if you want more information on that. So I think you get, some of Lady Russell's thought process and Sir Walter's thought process and even Mr. Shepherd's thought process. But as for Anne in these first 3 chapters, you don't see things via Anne much at all. Like almost none, really. Like a couple quickie little sentences, and that's it, as compared to pages and pages for other people, right? But yeah, you don't see things through her as though you're looking through her into the world. Look, maybe some people would say that this is a distinction without a difference, but I think it's as though the reader is sitting next to her instead of going inside her head. So you as the reader experience the environment that she is in, but not her interior perception of it, if that makes sense. So for these first 3 chapters, the narrative structure mimics how she is treated and perceived by her family, which I think I already said, sidelined, forgotten, taken for granted, without specific attention, moved on from, shoved over. They don't care. And in mostly leaving her out narratively, as her family does, you get a really good sense of the emotional and intellectual suffocation of that environment. And also, as another little argument for why I don't think the opening 3 chapters are, through Anne, is because, the narrative voice does tell us a couple things in these chapters at different points that I don't think Anne knows or would know to report to the reader at that point in time. So anyway, all of this is to say that, I feel like this is consciously done. I don't really think Austen does things accidentally. I mean, her novels feel tightly woven to me. And, it feels to me like it's done in order to make that true introduction to Anne, when the story turns and the reader does finally get to enter into her consciousness at the start of chapter 4, much more impactful. She's on the edges, and then all of a sudden, bam, there she is outside having this emotional moment by herself, whispering to nobody that maybe soon he will be walking here again. It's like you finally met her. It's like you finally met her for the first time. You actually see her. And that's the moment where I think the narrative voice pivots for the most part and goes into Anne, where it then stays for much of the novel. Not all of it, but a lot of it. But those first 3 chapters, I'm just so struck by them. like I said, I've just been thinking about them so much. They feel so intentionally crafted to keep Anne low and constrained, you know? Like, think how different that opening would be if you immediately got introduced to Anne in the flesh, perhaps, you know, being rejected in some way by her, you know, awful, terrible family, and contemplating that. Or some sort of really detailed summary of Lady Elliot's death, which we don't get a whole lot of, by the way, but what we do get is very fascinating. But yeah, if we got a really detailed explanation of Lady Elliot's death and like how that affected Anne, it would be so tonally different than that immediate dive into Sir Walter and his baronetage book. Like, think how different that would be. Not as good, by the way, which I'm sure Jane knows. Jane knows, okay? So that Austen chooses here in the beginning to keep her underneath the immediate actions and feelings and speeches of every other person in her life means that whenever that doesn't happen in the book, in terms of plot, narration, whatever, whenever she is thought of, whenever she is accommodated, listened to, given narrative precedence, you notice it. Because you as the reader know what it was like when it wasn't there. And, you know, spoiler, I think that very much plays into how things go with Captain Wentworth, but I won't spoil it for you. Anyway, you know how it felt narratively to not hear her, to not see her, to have her be unappreciated, ignored. And you appreciate her life and what she has had to endure more fully, I think, from it being structured this way. And also, just sort of as a final closing wrap up, I think it's significant that even given all of that, like, I just don't feel like you can get through these first 3 chapters without being like, whew, these people, like, whew, they are pieces of work. Like, you know, like they're tiring. But even given all of that, like this environment that she's been in for so long, Anne is not without spirit. You know, her first line of dialogue that I read shows that, you know, she really has pluck. I think maybe it's just sort of an unusual bent, perhaps due to this, what would you say, sort of benign neglectance existence that she's had. She has learned how to choose her battles, you know, wait for the moment to say the thing, right? And of course we know that Jane Austen loved unconventional heroines, like that was kind of her whole thing, and she did not write stereotypical main female characters for the most part, and I just love that for this perhaps most divergent main character, I think you can make a good argument for that, she also chose a really antithetical opening structure to bring her to the reader. It's just, you know, genius as usual for Jane Austen, you know, just another Tuesday, but I'd expect nothing less, and it's just why I love her so much. So thank you for listening to me blather on about this for however long it's been. I'm sure I'll find out while editing and it'll be a treat. But yeah, I just really wanted to yammer about that. I just think it's so fascinating, and I keep pondering it because in case you hadn't noticed by now, I really, really love Jane Austen. I think she gives you so much. Even if you go back and reread, as I did with this book, you get more, you find more, which is just fabulous. It's fabulous. That's why I love her. So, we shall see what the next video will be about, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks for watching.